This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Following the recent G20 summit in Bali, world leaders are now gathering in Thailand for this year's APEC Economic Leaders Week in their first face-to-face meeting since 2018. What's on the agenda of this year's gathering? How can the Asia-Pacific region continue to shine as the economic engine of global growth? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by Victor Gao-Zhikai, Chair Professor at Suzhou University, Professor Robert Kelly from the Department of Political Science at Pusan National University, and Chang Van-Ri, President of the Asian Vision Institute based in Cambodia. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion, gentlemen. Victor, we'll start with you. One day before the leaders' meeting, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a written speech on the APEC CEO Summit, which, where he called for joint efforts in breaking new ground in development and building an Asia-Pacific community with a shared future. Here is the view of the president that, at a time of multiple crises, economies in this region should become more closely interconnected and foster a better sense of community. Maybe that's a better way to deal with the crisis?
Absolutely. I think the APEC region, like many other parts of the world, is suffering from the headwinds created by a multitude of crises in different parts of the world, including war or peace. And therefore, I think, as President Xi Jinping emphasized in his written speech, it is absolutely important for APEC region, for APEC country leaders and governments and organizations, companies of the APEC member states to unite and to put in a joint effort in promoting cooperation and grow for each other's benefit, for example, rather than, for example, suffering the headwinds from the multitude of crises, many of which came from other parts of the world, or, for example, degenerating into another Cold War among member states, etc. In this sense, I think APEC is really promoting cooperation, and it's an open-ended process. It is a substantive cooperation. It is very different from some other framework, which actually is not all-inclusive development, which actually is based upon artificial picking of sides, for example, or deliberately excluding other countries from participation. Therefore, I think China's position is very clear. China is very much a part of the Asia-Pacific region. China promotes the APEC cooperation, and China will continue to be a major champion of APEC cooperation going forward. This is absolutely important, and the fact that President Xi Jinping is the head of state, President of China, which is one of the most important members of APEC, attending the APEC summit in person also means that China does attach unparalleled importance to APEC summit and APEC CEO meetings, for example, and China will be a leading force promoting greater cooperation and greater integration within the APEC framework.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, unlike Europe, of course, there's no military conflict in this region, but still we have this U.S. competition with China, for example. But right. At this particular time, point of time, facing such multiple crises, food crises, energy shortages, and also climate change, etc., pandemic. But isn't it that a better approach, probably, sense of community, closer integration, closer agreement, cooperation? Say this is a better solution than reducing connectivity or building up, walls and barriers between regions and countries?
Sure, definitely. And I think it's great that President Xi and President Biden met the G20 and shook hands. That's a good step forward. I think the United States and China have a lot of strategic differences, which we've discussed many times on this show, but that doesn't necessarily mean they don't have areas of interest that overlap. which is also something that I've emphasized in the time I've been on this show over the years, that China and the United States worry about a lot of things like climate change, North Korea, trade and finance, the use of nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine war. I mean, these are all things where China and the United States have pretty clear interests. And if we can find a way to strategically put on hold the conflicts over the East China Sea and the South China Sea, I think that the United States and China can, in fact, forge some limited cooperation on these areas. I think ideologically compatibility is pretty difficult, right? I mean, that's pretty clear from the G20 meeting. But I think both President Xi and President Biden at the meeting both also realized that a certain amount of cooperation, at least sort of driven by interests, is valuable, and we should do those sorts of things. And so APEC is actually a good format for that. I think one of the bigger problems with APEC is less sort of Sino-US competition. I mean, that's obviously a big issue. I think really the bigger issue for APEC is simply the scale of it. There's so many partners, there's so many sort of actors involved in APEC that it's actually difficult to sort of forge agreements because you have so many possible veto players, and APEC acts by consensus. But as your other guests has sort of noted, right, I mean, the United States and China are sort of the big drivers, the biggest economies in APEC. And so if they can sit down and sort of hammer out some deals and say North Korean nuclear weapons, that's a really big step forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, as you said, exactly beyond China and the United States, there are very important stakeholders inside this APEC group. For example, Thailand, the host of this country, they are promoting the theme of this year's APEC meeting as open, connect, and balance. Open to all opportunities, connect in all dimensions, and balance in all aspects. Very ambitious goals. Why do these elements important for countries in this region, countries' economies in this quite a wide region, let's say across the Pacific?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's because I think we are beginning to see an economic delinking between the United States and China, and that will be to everyone's sort of bad outcome, right? That will be a poor outcome for everybody, right? That will be sort of a rollback of some of the successes of globalization, which has sort of brought down prices in the global economy for several decades and kept inflation lower and things like that. It's reduced redundancy and improved efficiencies and stuff like that. It's actually sort of good economically if China and the United States are trading and interacting. But the strategic issues, again, as we talked about many times in this show, the strategic issues are starting to drive an economic delinking, and that is increasing, right? I mean, we just had sort of the Biden administration make these big announcements about technology trade with China. That's going to really set the Chinese off, and there's going to be a pretty serious, I imagine there'll be a fairly serious trade conflict over this in the coming years. And so I think that's in part what the Thai message was about, sort of balance and connectivity and openness, right? It's trying to sort of prevent the United States and China from sliding into a trade war, which, like I said, I think is a reasonable possibility at this point over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Victor, this will be the first in-person meeting of APEC leaders since 2018 due to this COVID pandemic. Given what Robert has talked about, China-U.S. relationship here, and you have this 21 economies are pushing for more cooperation and integration, even between China and the U.S. So, what are your expectations for this year's meeting?
First of all, you and the other distinguished panelists talked about the decoupling that the United States wants to drive for between China and the United States. Allow me to emphasize one point. Decoupling between China and the United States is a mission impossible. Secondly, if it is really pursued, it will bring greater disaster to the United States as well as in China. Allow me to remind our audience that actually the discovery of the United States, the discovery of America, was actually part of the pursuit of Columbus in searching of China by sailing west. So 5 years ago, the world is already connected. So how can 5 years later the United States really want to decouple with China? It will not be realistic and viable. I think China and the United States, the two greatest, largest economies in the world, will remain connected. And the decoupling is a fantasy, and the decoupling is not worthwhile for the United States to pursue at all, unless it will be done at huge cost, at great detriment to the fundamental interests of the American people. Secondly, I think APEC need to stay, and APEC need to be more and more substantive. I would say APEC is very different from IPEF, for example, Indo-Pacific, for example. Indo-Pacific is neither Indo nor Pacific, because APEC includes all member states around the rim of the Pacific Ocean, including, for example, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Peru, and Chile, for example, in the Americas, as well as countries here on the western side of the Pacific. But Indo-Pacific, no, it's very artificial. It is very selective. It is basically those I like in the club, those I do not like excluded. But how can you exclude China, which is the largest trading partner with more than 130 other countries and regions in the world? It is really indulging in fantasy again. So I think APEC will be more substantiated, APEC will be more meaningful, and APEC will really becoming more and more as a real entity, linking economies around the rim of the Pacific Ocean, both here in Asia as well as in North America and South America, closer. And I would say Pacific will no longer be a barrier. Pacific in itself will become a connectivity. And countries and regions and economies and people of all these countries around the rim of Pacific will really have a better chance to engage with each other, to talk with each other, to do business with each other, and to achieve higher level of connectivity with each other. I think decoupling or disconnectivity are not good for any of the countries or regions around the Asian Pacific rim. Therefore, I think the task is to make clear APEC's mission and how to achieve the APEC's mission, how to really achieve greater openness, greater connectivity, and resilience of the development and sustainability of the development going forward.
Well, as Victor said, instead of decoupling or disengagement, Chiang, welcome to the show. A free trade area among APEC economies is seen as one of the most important agendas for discussion. Thailand, the host country, is working with the 20 APEC economies to advance this Asia-Pacific Free Trade Area, or FTAAP initiative. According to the Thai side, the topic will be presented at the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting. Since the roadmap was proposed in 2014, quite a few years back, how far are we from reaching a final agreement?
There are some barriers and obstacles in reaching this kind of a fully integrated regional trade arrangement. And one of the barriers is the U.S. kind of a strategic competition with China, and this kind of strategy to decouple or to relocate or offshore or reshore or friendshore the supply chains network across Indo-Pacific. So this is a very unfortunate development caused by geopolitical competition and effects on trade. But what we can see is that the trend is there to promote open and sustainable trade in the region. And the member countries, the member states, especially the small and medium-sized economies, are very keen to further deepen trade integration across the region. But as I said, the ball seems to be in the U.S. court now, whether the U.S. is willing to further deepen trade within the region.
Well, Robert, obviously the political atmosphere in the U.S. Is quite, let's say, anti-free trade. It's like a poisonous words, free trade or trade inside the U.S. Politically. But obviously, not only China, but also smaller economies in this region, they are expecting, as Chiang pointed out, eagerly for more integration, more free trade among the economies. What's the U.S. response?
Yeah, so free trade has always been sort of politically unpopular in the United States. I think that's correct, right? Free trade has long had opponents on the American left and the Democratic Party, particularly labor, right? And that's actually quite common in democracies. And then also, as you've pointed out, right, free trade relationship, particularly with China, has become very politically contentious on the right in the United States. And you've seen a kind of unity, I think, of sort of broadly the left and the right on trade with China. There's been sort of an emerging consensus that U.S. trade with China should be controlled and should be limited. As I said, this is suboptimal, and this will actually, it's interesting, your other guests mentioned sort of who's going to impact the worst. I would actually argue that China and the United States have to actually have the ability to sustain decoupling and protectionism better actually than many of their trading partners, right? I would actually suggest that it's countries like Thailand, it's small countries in Southeast Asia that are heavily dependent on exports, places like Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, places like that. Those are the places that are actually going to suffer from it the most, because both sides are going to start to reevaluate their trade relations with other states to find out if sort of the Chinese, the Americans are getting this advantage or that advantage, right? The United States and China both have pretty large internal markets in the American case, right? That internal market somewhat includes the Europeans, which will give a sort of fallback space, I think, for a decoupling. So I'm actually less pessimistic on the economic costs, and I think that will make the political goal of decoupling easier. But I mean, yes, it is suboptimal, right? And many smaller countries, particularly exporters in Southeast Asia and in other poor regions like Latin America, are going to suffer because suddenly their trade access is going to become sort of renewed under question, and the American government will start saying, are you trading with China this product and that product? And again, we've already seen this coming, right? Because the United States has a particular tendency to export its laws, to apply its laws extraterritorially, which is sort of the expression that we use in American law, which is to say that if the Americans say you can't trade XYZ with China, we often force our allies, we sort of twist their arm to do that too. And you can see that, for example, with the use of Huawei technology. So again, yeah, I think that things are going to start to come apart.
So, I mean, as this reality, the U.S. trying to push, its allies and other members probably say, okay, to shift your supply chain or to make some changes, to do less trade with China. How is that realistic, Victor? As you said, China is the largest trading partner for ASEAN countries, for Japan, for Australia, for South Korea, for example, in this region. I would say that would be probably, if it's achieved, it must be with devastating consequence for local economies.
First of all, I think Washington overestimates its own capabilities. Secondly, Washington underestimates the desire for a greater independence by all the other countries in the world. There are many countries which are friendly with the United States, of course. There are many countries which are allies of the United States. But I don't think there are many countries in the world of today which want to sacrifice their fundamental bread and butter economic interest in order to please Washington. That's against the fundamental interest of the people in those countries. And, for example, if the United States no longer becomes the champion of free trade, then what becomes of the United States? It becomes a drag on free trade. It becomes a destroyer of free market, for example. It really turns everything upside down in terms of philosophy, in terms of its tradition, for example. From a self-claimed champion of free trade, for the United States to become a destroyer of free trade, holy cow, I think that probably will create more disadvantage to the competitiveness of the United States. So I hope decision makers in Washington will really become more philosophical, wiser, for example, and more result-oriented rather than purely driven by their inspirations or aspirations, which may not be really attached to the realities on the ground.
Ideology. Chiam, you are based in Cambodia. Tell us, what are the Southeast Asian economies, countries, their sense of this, competition, Washington with Beijing, and also the U.S., lack of desire to continue with free trade, more trade among economies in this region, for example?
Well, ASEAN or Southeast Asia have its own way. By realizing the regional comprehensive economic partnership. So this is the way forward. And some members are also the member of a comprehensive progressive Trans-Pacific partnership. So that is fine. We have alternative kind of regional trading arrangements that we will facilitate the trade flow within the region. So that is the options that we have across the region. But with regards to the market access to the U.S., of course, we keep pressuring the U.S. to open more markets because we still export rented economies across the region. But now China also is a big market now for especially agricultural products and other materials. So that is another potential when China keeps growing in the post-pandemic era, for instance. So that is a strategic kind of a diversification from reliance on the U.S. market to more China market. So that is a hedging diversification strategy that's been implemented across the Southeast Asia. And I think, look at the trend of the trade. Perhaps we are the producer and consumer. So the Asian continent, especially East Asia. So we become more resilient.
Yeah, the Asian countries are becoming more resilient. And of course, both China and the US are large markets for the rest of the economies, let's say, for the APEC members here. Victor, China is a member of RCEP, the Regional and Comprehensive Economic Partnership, 15 countries in this region. And also China is applying to join the CPTPP, Comprehensive Progressive, previously Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? 10 countries, China is applying to join that higher threshold for free trade. And then DEPA, Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, I would say led actually by smaller economies. For example, I think it's Singapore, New Zealand, for example. But they are writing these rules for digital economy or digital trade over there, very advanced grouping there. So that's obviously, in a sense of free trade, China is moving in the right direction to do more trade in various means with the regional economies. That probably will play a role for a closer economy here.
Well, the reality is that in today's world, China is eager to join whatever framework of countries which really can promote free trade, greater connectivity. Even for CPTPP, we know CPTPP was predated with TPP, which was very much driven by the United States, which was ironically designed to exclude China, not to include China.
Right.
But China philosophically is very sane and balanced, and it now applies to become a member of CPTPP, even though I believe there are hurdles and there are missions, possible or impossible, to be accomplished, for example, for China to become a member. But the fact that China is applying for CPTPP indicates in very great eloquence that China wants to join CPTPP, even though its predecessor was designed to exclude China. This shows China's courage and commitment to free trade. And if you want to talk about upgrading the levels of participation, we can upgrade ourselves. If you want to talk about a higher threshold, we can try our best to live up to the higher threshold, for example. Now, talking about a digital economy, I think China is now becoming one of the leading countries in terms of digital economy. The reason is that when we talk about digital economy, it needs to be economy of scale. And China, population 1.4 billion, the second largest economy by official exchange rate, and then the largest economy by purchasing power parity. China today is about 6 times larger than India, for example, almost 4 times as big as Japan. And every day in the Chinese language communities in China, we generate possibly more data than any other language pools. So this is all the wealth upon which the digital economy will be built upon in China. So I even want to say that the digital pool involving the Chinese language going forward will be at least one of the 2 largest pools of the digital universe in the world in the coming years, if not the largest pool ever. That means China will have a very important role to play in digital economy. But we want to share this benefit with all the other countries, not only ASEAN countries, APEC member states, and all the other Asian Pacific or Indo-Ocean countries, European countries, you name it. We want to be as open-minded as possible. We want to create a truly win-win situation. We do not like barriers, for example, or separations or decoupling.
I think China itself has benefited greatly from trade and investment. In particular in dealing with other countries, of course, other economies. Robert, beyond trade and free trade, Thailand as a hosting country, this year they introduced this idea like a bio, circular, and green economy concept, or BCG concept, into this APEC conversation. as a promising post-pandemic growth strategy. What do you make of this model? It seems to me, stress very much about the green growth and circular economy, and of course, biodiversity. Very progressive ideas here.
Right. Yeah, it's long overdue, right? I mean, if China and the United States don't get along in 100 years, it won't make any difference because the planet's going to be,
Right.
gray from soot and pollution, right? I mean, this is sort of one of the things that I always like to sort of emphasize on this network as an American guest is that China and the United States actually share a lot of interests, most obviously in climate change, right? I mean, our grandkids are going to be living on a pretty polluted planet, and we should all be actually really concerned about that. Green growth is something that we all share an interest in, right? For whatever that might be, solar panels and batteries and things like that, electric cars. I mean, all of us should be getting behind that. And it's interesting that littoral states, particularly in Southeast Asia, will be interested in this. A lot of them are heavily exposed, right? Sort of the effects of climate change are going to be worse for littoral states near the equator. So it's actually kind of not too surprising that Southeast Asian states would be suggesting this. But again, I mean, this is a nice way for the United States and China to sort of put aside strategic and political issues, not have big arguments about Taiwan and human rights and whatever, and actually focus on something that might actually sort of benefit all of us. Right. But again, I mean, the argument here is going to be the distribution of costs, right? Who will actually make the changes, right? This has been one of the big problems on climate change movement in the past, right? Sort of who's going to pay for things, right? And a lot of countries in the global south say that wealthier countries should pay, and there's been sort of resistance on that. And so I would imagine that this will actually sort of be folded into that larger debate about who should pay. But in principle, the idea of green growth is excellent, and we should be moving towards it as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. It's great to see Thailand taking the initiative of building a green economy in this region. Chiang, restoring travel and tourism in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic is also one of the priorities of this year's APEC meetings. Thailand is forming this Safe Passage Task Force to coordinate, safe and seamless resumption of cross-border travel. How important is this resumption of travel and tourism for APEC's economic rebound, in particular for, I would say, Southeast Asian economies like Thailand, like Cambodia?
Well, before talking about the tourism, I just would like to stress the importance of green economy, which is gaining momentum across Southeast Asia. Cambodia, as a chair of ASEAN this year, has proposed ASEAN Green Deal in order to promote this kind of green economy and green kind of a movement across the region. So tourism, coming back to tourism is the one of the key economic sectors that contribute significantly to the GDP and employment because most of the countries in Southeast Asia pretty much rely on tourism. The intra-regional tourist flow is quite significant now. So ASEAN member states, ASEAN citizens visit each other. It's the highest now for the country like Cambodia, for instance. The travel within APEC, of course, will be significant to boost the economic recovery across Southeast Asia. But the thing is now we don't have the inflow of Chinese tourists to this region yet. So hopefully in the near future, China will kind of open up to this kind of safe travel so that the region can welcome more Chinese tourists because, as I said, tourism is one of the key economic sector across Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm. Victor, I mean, for sure, China will open. If you look at the situation now, it's moving toward that direction. Briefly, 30 seconds.
Yes, absolutely. I think mankind is not completely out of the woods as far as this COVID-19 pandemic is concerned. But I think China, as the rest of the world, we are all moving in the right direction. It may still take some time, but I truly believe one day we will put this COVID-19 overhang behind us, and China will really, truly, substantially re-engage with the world. And I want to assure the distinguished panelists from Thailand, the Chinese tourists Cambodia, the Chinese tourists will come back to Cambodia to visit all the historical sites,
as well
all
as
the old
Thailand.
friends, etc., as well as Thailand and other ASEAN countries.
Yes. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo on behalf of our team. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.